Good evening, Generals, and welcome to a new episode of Unsung Heroes. It starts in Saipan Island, July 1944. The volcanic rock is still warm from the flamethrowers. Inside a limestone cave network, 800 Japanese soldiers and civilians huddle together, convinced that the Americans outside will torture them, rape them, eat them alive. Their officers have told them death is preferable. Some have already chosen grenades over surrender. Then they hear it, a voice, speaking perfect Japanese, not the broken textbook Japanese of military translators, but the real thing, street Japanese, working-class Tokyo dialect. The voice is calm, almost friendly. You don't have to die today. The voice belongs to a Marine private. He's 18 years old, Mexican-American, born in East Los Angeles, raised in a Japanese family. He has no backup. No officers gave him permission for this. He's standing alone at the mouth of the cave with a stolen Japanese rifle and a white flag made from a torn undershirt. His name is Guy Gabaldon, and he's about to do something the United States Marine Corps will spend the next 60 years trying to explain. Here's what doesn't make sense. The official story of World War II in the Pacific is built on a simple truth. Japanese soldiers didn't surrender. The Bushido Code, the Emperor's divine mandate, the shame of capture. These weren't just propaganda. They were operational realities. Marines learned quickly that a wounded Japanese soldier might detonate a grenade when you tried to give him water. Surrender was so rare that it became newsworthy. The numbers bear this out. On Tarawa, out of 4,700 Japanese defenders, only 17 were captured. On Peleliu, 10,000 Japanese troops fought to the death. 146 surrendered. These weren't just soldiers. On Saipan, civilians threw their children off cliffs rather than face American captivity. So explain Guy Gabaldon, a kid who never graduated high school, no formal training in interrogation, no rank beyond private first class. And yet, over the course of the Saipan campaign, he personally captured more than 800 Japanese soldiers and civilians, alone, often without permission, sometimes against direct orders. The Marine Corps gave him a Silver Star. He thought he deserved the Medal of Honor. For 60 years, he fought to get it upgraded. He never did. This is the story of why. Guy Louis Gabaldon was born wrong for his time. March 1926, East Los Angeles. His parents were Mexican immigrants. Poor didn't cover it. They were survival mode poor. The kind where childhood ends at age 10 because you're working to eat. Guy was one of 7 kids in a house where English was the second language, and opportunity was a fantasy sold to other people. At age 12, he made a decision that changed everything. He moved in with a Japanese-American family, not as a servant, not as hired help, as a son. The Nakanos were first-generation immigrants, running a small business in the heart of LA's Little Tokyo. They had 5 sons. They took in Guy because his family couldn't afford to feed him, and because the Nakanos believed in something specific. You take care of your own block, your own neighborhood, your own people. Guy became the 6th son. He learned Japanese the way children do, by immersion, by necessity, by osmosis, not textbook Japanese, street Japanese. He learned how to argue in Japanese, how to joke in Japanese, how to talk his way out of trouble in Japanese. He learned the culture from the inside, the respect hierarchies, the indirect communication styles, the concept of face, of obligation, of shame. He learned what it meant to be Japanese-American in 1930s California, which meant he learned what it meant to be hated. Then came December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor didn't just change American foreign policy, it changed the temperature in every room Guy walked into. Overnight, his adoptive family became enemy aliens. Their bank accounts were frozen. Their business was marked. Within months, Executive Order 9066 sent the entire Nakano family to Manzanar internment camp. Guy tried to visit them. He was turned away. They were American citizens locked behind barbed wire in the California desert, and there was nothing he could do about it. So he enlisted. 17 years old, lied about his age, joined the Marines. The same organization that was fighting the people who looked like his family, spoke like his family, cooked like his family. He wasn't confused about this. He was angry, the way only teenagers can be angry, pure, focused, self-righteous. He would prove something. What exactly he probably couldn't articulate, but he would prove it. The Marines sent him to Camp Pendleton, then to Guadalcanal as a scout and observer, then to Saipan. Nobody asked if he spoke Japanese. Nobody cared about his background. He was a rifleman, a body, a Marine, until he decided he wasn't. Saipan was supposed to be strategic. June 1944. The island was Japanese home territory, part of the inner defensive ring protecting the mainland. 29,000 Japanese troops dug into volcanic caves and dense jungle. The American plan was simple and brutal. Naval bombardment, amphibious landing, grind forward until the island was secured. The Marines landed on June 15th. Casualties were immediate and catastrophic. Japanese artillery hidden in the hills, snipers in the palm trees, banzai charges at night, hundreds of soldiers screaming as they ran directly into machine gun fire, trying to overwhelm positions through sheer suicidal momentum. Guy Gabaldon watched this and saw something nobody else did: waste. Every dead Japanese soldier was a soldier who could have told them where the artillery was hidden, where the supply dumps were located, where the next attack was coming from. Every civilian who jumped off a cliff was someone who didn't need to die. The problem was capture doctrine. American forces had interpreters, but they were officers, kept back at headquarters, used for interrogating prisoners who had already been captured. Nobody was out there trying to convince Japanese troops to surrender in the first place. Guy decided to try. First time he went alone, no permission. Just walked away from his unit during a lull in fighting and headed toward a cave system his squad had bypassed. He called out in Japanese, identified himself as American, said they wouldn't be killed. Nothing happened. He tried again. Different approach. He told them he was Japanese American, told them he understood what they'd been told about American torture and atrocities, told them it wasn't true, told them the war was already lost, that Saipan was falling, that dying here changed nothing. Two soldiers emerged, hands up, terrified. Guy walked them back to the American lines, handed them over. His sergeant asked where the hell he'd been. Guy told him. The sergeant stared at him like he'd grown a second head, but he didn't stop him. Here's where it gets complicated. The Marine Corps in 1944 was not built for improvisation. It was a machine. Orders flowed down. Results flowed up. Individual initiative was tolerated only when it resulted in dead enemy combatants or secured territory. What Guy was doing didn't fit the paperwork. He wasn't killing the enemy. He wasn't even capturing them in combat. He was negotiating, persuading, using psychological leverage that nobody had trained him to use because nobody thought it was possible. His technique was specific. He didn't just speak Japanese. He spoke it with the right cultural framing. He understood hierarchy. When he called into a cave, he addressed the officers first, with proper respect. He gave them a way to save face. He explained surrender not as defeat, but as protecting their men from pointless death. He offered practical details: food, medical care, safety from reprisals. He lied when he needed to, told them American forces were larger than they were, told them reinforcements weren't coming, told them the Emperor had sanctioned strategic withdrawals. Total fabrication, but delivered with enough confidence that desperate men believed it. And it worked. After the first 2 soldiers, he brought in 12 more, then 30, then 100. His superiors didn't know what to do with him. On one hand, prisoners were valuable. Intelligence officers wanted to interrogate them. On the other hand, Guy was operating outside the command structure. He was disappearing during combat operations. He was exposing himself to enormous risk, walking up to enemy positions alone, armed with nothing but language and nerve. They should have court-martialed him. Instead, they gave him unofficial permission to continue. Not orders, not formal authorization, just a tacit understanding. Keep doing it, but if you get killed, that's on you. Guy kept doing it. July 7, 1944. The Japanese defense was collapsing. American forces had pushed the Japanese defenders to the northern tip of Saipan. Thousands of soldiers and civilians were trapped in the rocky coastal terrain around Marpi Point. The cliffs there dropped 200 feet straight into the ocean. There was nowhere to retreat. Japanese command made a final decision. Gyokusai, shattering of the jewel. A mass banzai charge. Every able-bodied soldier would attack in one suicidal wave, hoping to inflict maximum casualties before being annihilated. The civilians were told to jump. At dawn, 3,000 Japanese soldiers charged. They overran American positions through sheer numbers. Marines fought them in the dark with bayonets, rifle butts, fists. When the sun came up, bodies were piled 4 deep. The Japanese force was destroyed. American casualties were catastrophic. At the cliffs, civilians were throwing their children into the sea and jumping after them. Gabaldon heard about this and made a decision. He grabbed a translator, another Marine who spoke marginal Japanese, and headed north. No orders, no backup, just him and one other guy, moving through territory that was still actively hostile. They found a cave system near the cliffs. Guy could hear voices inside, lots of them. Soldiers and civilians mixed together. He estimated 50, maybe 100 people. He called out, used every trick he'd learned, appealed to their humanity, told them the war was over, told them their emperor wouldn't want them to die for nothing, told them American forces would feed them, treat their wounded, let them live. The response was a grenade. It missed. Guy didn't run. He kept talking, kept his voice calm, shifted his approach, started addressing the officers directly, used formal language, showed respect, offered them a choice, surrender with honor, or watch their people die in a cave. An officer emerged, then another, then everyone else. Guy counted as they came out. 50, 70, 100, 150. They kept coming. Soldiers, civilians, wounded men on stretchers, children, elderly women. He hadn't stumbled onto a military position. He'd found a refugee camp. Final count, 800 people. He marched them back to American lines alone. 1 Marine, 800 prisoners. When he arrived, the rear echelon troops thought it was a Japanese counterattack. They almost opened fire. Guy's commanding officer saw the column and went silent, just stared. Then asked the only question that made sense. "How the hell did you do that?" Guy shrugged. "I asked nicely." The Marine Corps gave Guy Gabaldon a Silver Star, 3rd highest combat decoration. Citation praised his courage, initiative, and success in persuading enemy forces to surrender. Standard ceremony, handshake from a colonel, photo for the papers. Guy thought he deserved the Medal of Honor. He wasn't wrong. Look at the criteria. The Medal of Honor is awarded for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. Guy walked alone into active combat zones, unarmed or lightly armed, and convinced enemy soldiers to surrender through sheer force of will and cultural understanding. He saved American lives by preventing banzai charges. He saved Japanese lives by pulling them out of caves before flamethrowers arrived. He personally captured more enemy combatants than entire battalions. Other Marines received the Medal of Honor for single acts of heroism that lasted minutes. Guy did it for weeks. So why didn't he get it? The official reason: lack of documentation. Most of Guy's actions happened alone or with minimal witnesses. The mass surrender of 800 was verified, but the dozens of smaller captures weren't properly recorded. The fog of war, missing paperwork, unreliable field reports. The unofficial reason: the Marine Corps didn't want to explain him. Think about the optics. Summer 1944. America is still fighting a brutal race war in the Pacific. Propaganda posters depict Japanese soldiers as subhuman monsters. The entire war effort is built on dehumanization. You can't ask teenagers to burn men alive with flamethrowers if you're simultaneously celebrating cultural understanding and negotiated surrender. Guy Gabaldon complicated the narrative. He proved Japanese soldiers would surrender if approached correctly. He proved language and culture mattered. He proved the official doctrine that Japanese fanaticism made surrender impossible was wrong. Not incomplete, wrong. Awarding him the Medal of Honor would require admitting that thousands of lives could have been saved if the military had trained and deployed more people like him. It would raise uncomfortable questions about why they didn't. So they gave him a Silver Star and moved on. Guy didn't move on. Guy Gabaldon came home in 1945. He was 19 years old. The Nakanos were released from Manzanar. They'd lost their business, their savings, years of their lives. Guy visited them. They welcomed him like he'd never left, cooked for him, asked about the war, didn't talk about the camps. Guy tried civilian life, struggled. Post-traumatic stress wasn't called that yet. It was adjustment problems, or war nerves, or nothing at all. He had nightmares, drank too much, couldn't hold jobs. The skills that made him exceptional in combat, aggression, vigilance, the ability to talk his way through impossible situations, didn't translate to peacetime. In 1957, Hollywood noticed him. They made a movie, Hell to Eternity. Jeffrey Hunter played Guy. The film depicted his story with typical 1950s Hollywood embellishments. Romantic subplots, dramatic music, simplified history. It was popular. It introduced Guy's story to millions. It also got the details wrong. Downplayed the racial dynamics. Made him more white, more conventional, more palatable. Guy hated it and promoted it anyway, because at least people knew his name. He spent the next 50 years fighting for recognition. Wrote letters, lobbied Congress, gave speeches, argued that his Silver Star should be upgraded to the Medal of Honor, presented documentation, eyewitness testimony, official records. The Pentagon reviewed his case multiple times. Every time they said no, not enough evidence. Too much time had passed. Regulations had changed. The criteria were different now. Bureaucratic language that meant, we've decided, and we're not changing our minds. Guy died in 2006, 80 years old, still fighting, still angry, still convinced he'd been cheated. 2 years later, the Pentagon finally upgraded his award, not to the Medal of Honor, to the Navy Cross, second highest decoration. The citation acknowledged his extraordinary heroism and uncommon valor. It was signed posthumously. Here's the uncomfortable truth about Guy Gabaldon's story. He proved that the dominant narrative of the Pacific War, that Japanese fanaticism made surrender culturally impossible, was incomplete at best, propaganda at worst. His success rate suggests that thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians would have surrendered if approached by someone who understood their language and culture. But the United States military never scaled his approach. They didn't recruit and train Japanese-American Marines to do what Guy did. They didn't develop formal surrender negotiation protocols. They didn't integrate cultural understanding into combat doctrine. They continued using flamethrowers, grenades, and naval bombardment to clear caves, even after Guy had demonstrated a better way. Why? The simple answer: institutional inertia. The military is slow to change. What works stays. What's unfamiliar is suspect. The complicated answer: Guy's methods required treating the enemy as human, as rational actors capable of being persuaded, as people with families and fears and the capacity to choose life over death. That's incompatible with total war. You can't ask soldiers to burn men alive in caves and simultaneously train them to negotiate with cultural sensitivity. You can't dehumanize the enemy in propaganda and then celebrate someone who succeeded by recognizing their humanity. The cognitive dissonance is unbearable. So the military celebrated Guy just enough to avoid embarrassment, then buried his techniques in the historical record as an interesting aberration. One remarkable individual, not a model, not a method, just a guy who got lucky. Fast forward. Iraq, Afghanistan, 20 years of counterinsurgency. The United States military finally learned what Guy Gabaldon tried to teach them in 1944. Language matters, culture matters, understanding your enemy saves lives. They created cultural support teams, hired local translators, developed psychological operations that used cultural knowledge to persuade rather than just intimidate. Soldiers deployed with language training and cultural advisors. It worked. Not perfectly, but better than the alternative. Nobody mentioned Guy Gabaldon's name in the policy papers or training manuals. His story didn't fit the institutional narrative of the military learning from its mistakes, because acknowledging him would mean admitting they'd ignored the lesson for 60 years. In 2010, the Marine Corps finally issued a formal statement acknowledging Guy's contributions to the Saipan campaign. Standard PR language praised his courage, noted his unique circumstances, called him a pioneer in combat psychology. They still didn't upgrade his award to the Medal of Honor. Let's go back to that cave on Saipan. July 1944. Guy Gabaldon is standing at the entrance, alone. 800 people inside, convinced they're about to die. His voice is the only thing between them and suicide. What was going through his mind? Not patriotism. Guy wasn't doing this for flag and country. He was doing it because the alternative was stupid. Waste made him angry. Unnecessary death made him angry. The idea that people had to die because nobody bothered to talk to them made him furious. Not heroism in the traditional sense. Heroes charge machine guns and throw themselves on grenades. Guy walked up to caves and had conversations. There's nothing cinematic about negotiation. No dramatic music, no slow-motion sacrifice. Just words and patience and the willingness to stand in an uncomfortable place until something changed. What he had was empathy, not the shallow kind. Not, I feel sorry for you, empathy. The deep, structural kind. The empathy that comes from living inside another culture, speaking another language, understanding how people think when they think in words you can translate. He looked at Japanese soldiers and saw the Nakano brothers. He heard their language and remembered dinner table conversations in Little Tokyo. He understood they'd been lied to by their officers the same way he'd been overlooked by his. That made him dangerous. Not dangerous in the way soldiers are dangerous. Capable of violence, willing to kill. Dangerous in the way that people who refuse to accept the official story are dangerous. People who insist there's another way. People who demonstrate through their actions that the system is wrong. The United States Marine Corps in 1944 couldn't process Guy Gabaldon. He didn't fit the categories. He wasn't a translator. Those were officers. He wasn't a cultural advisor. That job didn't exist yet. He wasn't a hero in the approved sense. Heroes killed the enemy. They didn't save them. So they gave him a medal that almost meant something, then spent 60 years trying to forget him. But here's what they couldn't erase. 800 people who lived because one kid from East Los Angeles decided unnecessary death was unacceptable. That's not heroism. That's something rarer. That's someone who looked at the machinery of war and said, "This is broken and I'm going to fix it," then did. Guy Gabaldon returned to Saipan in 1990, 46 years after the battle. He visited the cliffs at Marpy Point, stood where civilians had jumped, walked through the cave systems where he'd convinced soldiers to surrender. He met some of them, men who'd emerged from caves in 1944 because a teenager told them they didn't have to die. They remembered his voice, remembered thinking he must be lying, that it was a trick, that the Americans would kill them as soon as they came out. Then they came out and lived. One of them asked Guy why he'd done it, why he'd risked his life for enemy soldiers. Guy's answer was simple: because you weren't the enemy. You were just on the other side. Thanks for watching.